This is the penultimate parable of Jesus in Matthew's Gospel. Last week we heard of the 10 virgins, the 5 wise and the 5 foolish, and Jesus' admonition to be ready, to be prepared, and to stay awake for whenever he, the bridegroom, comes. Being ready is not just meant for his second coming, but also for Jesus coming into our daily lives, with the people we interact with and the events of our day. Much like our second reading from St. Paul to the Thessalonians. So let's pause for a moment, if you would, and reflect on how did I encounter Christ this week? With that, let's see what the parable of the talents and the 3 servants has to teach us. Now, in the time of Jesus, 1 talent would be worth about $1.5 million. A huge amount now, and even much more for them as a mere servant entrusted to them. I got a laugh out of when the master said, well, you've been faithful in small matters. I'm thinking, man, give me $1.5 million as a small matter. I'll take care of a lot of things. Well, some of the early church fathers suggested that we look at this parable not so much monetarily as through the lens of faith and what one with the gift of faith has been given to them. Now, in and through our baptism, whether as a child or chosen as an adult, whether gifted, we have been gifted and entrusted by God with the life-giving, life-transforming gift of faith. Rather than focus on the 2 servants who were extraordinary stewards and multiplied their master's gift, I'd like to focus on the 3rd steward. He was still given an enormous amount of money, and with it, an important responsibility to the master. What motivated him to bury the talent, to keep it hopefully safe and hidden? I would suggest 2 answers. His fear of how he saw his master, and secondly, his own lack of self-awareness and self-confidence. He says, Master, I knew you were a demanding person, harvesting where you did not plant and gathering where you did not scatter. So, out of fear, I went off and buried the talent in the ground. Here it is back. The Master. What is your image of God? The Master. How do you experience God in your life? And I'm not thinking so much about our intellectual understanding of God, but rather our gut response, our heartfelt response to who God is in my life. Even though I grew up in a Catholic household, attended Catholic schools, and wanted to be a priest ever since my first Holy Communion, I was afraid of God. I mostly feared God, especially when I was younger, much like I feared my dad, who, with his Irish temper, would often yell and demand obedience from us. I learned early on that sin was bad, and then somehow made the connection that because I sinned, I was bad. I was unable to separate the two. As I matured and grew in faith, my image of God also grew. As I studied and prayed with sacred scripture, I realized I had a distorted image of God and how God acted in my life. Through seminary formation and spiritual direction, I discovered God who infinitely loves me. Another way to put it, the talent of faith given to me at baptism grew. Rather than being fearful of God, I delighted in God's love and sought to return to God with increase the fruits of faith that God had given to me. Growing up as I did, I lacked self-awareness and self-confidence. The same thing I think maybe that last steward experienced. Because of many factors too numerous to explain, I saw myself as lacking, not being enough, of not measuring up as a person. I often compared myself to others, seeing how deficient I was, what I lacked, what I felt I did not have. I lived in a world of scarcity, not abundance. I doubted myself. I hid my talents, my gifts, and abilities that God had given to me. I so often struggled, and as a result was less effective in my ministry than what God gifted me with. Now, I was not a wicked and lazy servant. I was a fearful steward. I was afraid to too deeply trust God and in the gift, the talent that God had given me. Well, that's a little of my story. What about yours? What about the stewardship of the gift of faith that God has entrusted to each of you? How is it manifested in your relationship as a spouse, a child, a parent, a Christian, as a beloved daughter or son of God? I urge you to take some time this week and to reflect on your talent, that is, the gift of faith that you have been given. How are you living into that gift? Pray about how that gift of faith can empower you to be who God has created you to be, uniquely in God's eyes. This is why our stewardship renewal each year is so important. It is not merely about getting enough people to serve in ministry or have enough money for our ministries. Rather, stewardship calls us to transformation, to a change of heart and mind and action. Stewardship invites us to name and nurture our gift of faith, to take a step in growing and sharing the gifts of our time, talent, and treasure, and then returning it with increase, sharing it with our community and beyond, for God's glory and for His kingdom. So I want to thank each and every one of you who have responded to the stewardship invitation this year. Thank you for your commitment. As of today, we've reached 60% of our stewardship participation goal. To continue to support the growth of our ministries and the needs of our parish, we need to hit the participation goal of 1,000 households. Today, we ask that those of you who have not yet participated to take the next few minutes to fill out your pledge cards and then place them in the offertory basket. Your commitment to prayer, service, and giving is vital to the life and mission of our parish. Therefore, I ask the folks at the edge of the pews, if you pick up the box of pens and pass them to your neighbor and take one if you need it, the pledge cards should be in the pew pockets before you. And we're just going to take a couple of minutes to allow folks who have not been able to do so to make a pledge this evening. Thank you for your generosity and your participation.
So I want to tell you about a young couple from the early 1200s. Louis and Elizabeth, let's call them Louis and Liz. I'm sure they'd like that. Louis and Liz were Hungarian royalty who were betrothed to each other at a young age. And when Louis married Liz, we might say with our first reading today that Louis had found a worthy wife whose value was far beyond pearls. Things were a bit different in the 1200s. Liz was only a young teenager, but she quickly began to give herself generously in service of the poor and the sick. And though she was literally a princess, she'd go out and bring food and clothing to the needy, and she'd personally serve the sick to the point of carrying them on her own shoulders. She even turned one of her castles into a hospital. And when she was about to have her third child, Louis went off to fight a crusade, got sick, and died on the way, leaving her a widow. Yet, despite her many sorrows, or maybe even propelled by them, she decided to give away the rest of what she could and consecrated herself to God. And she continued to work generously to serve those in need, built another hospital, and gave away everything she had except a single dress by the time that she died at the ripe old age of 24. Liz, or St. Elizabeth of Hungary, whose feast day was this past Friday, was a truly good and faithful servant. She understood that while she was certainly capable of giving up and isolating herself in her suffering, which was great, she would really find herself by giving herself away in love. And in finding herself, she would come to share in the Master's joy. Well, as great as St. Elizabeth is, I'm not St. Elizabeth, so why would any of us live any differently from the way that she did? Having received so many blessings from a good and gracious God, the author and giver of all that is good, how could anyone turn away from him to live in the darkness of isolation and selfishness? I think the answer is fear. Liz had something that kept her from turning away from God, and that's trust in the Master. She trusted in the Master who gives us his possessions, not just material wealth. God gives us time and life in this body, and also material things. And with this, he gives us freedom and the grace of his loving presence. But do we ever believe something different about God? Do we ever wonder if God really cares about us, if God cares about me, loves me, has done all this for me? If I do wonder that, then I might become afraid. Unable to trust God, I might turn in on myself and isolate myself. And other people, even God, might become threats to my safety. So I'll live in the darkness of my fear of their rejection or judgment. Alone inside the walls of my impenetrable heart, I can safely bury anything that I've received from that scary God who made this scary world. And this becomes a living hell. Why? Because While I sit on top of my buried talent, I'll find that I'm lonely and bored and no less afraid than before. Does this sound a bit familiar? Well, if so, we weren't made for this darkness. And in the words of St. Paul in our second reading today, all of you are children of the light. So how can I let this light into my darkness? First of all, by trusting the giver. The Master, the Father of light, sees the darkness closing in on us. Because of our rejection of his gift since the sin of Adam and Eve in the garden, sin and death have spread their hellish darkness over all of the world. God sees us walling up our hearts in fear, and he wants to give us his light to banish our darkness. He wants this so much that he sends his Son, the light of the world, who enters into our dying flesh, even to the point of dying on the cross, when he descends into the hell of our isolation, our loneliness, and our boredom. And filling this hell with light, Jesus breaks its power over us and gives us a new freedom and the hope of everlasting happiness through the power of his risen life. And when he returns to the Father in his ascension, he doesn't stop giving. Jesus sends us, he gives us his Spirit, the Lord, the giver of life, who brings us into union with Jesus and makes our lives like his. So instead of isolating ourselves in fear and becoming lonely and bored, we can reach out in trust to enter into union, into communion with Jesus and with his whole mystical body, the church. And instead of turning in on ourselves in the safe boredom of our self-centered life, we can learn to give ourselves more and more generously along with Jesus, who gives himself for us. When we love with Jesus, we'll come to find ourselves because Jesus will show us who we're meant to be. And when we love like Jesus, we'll come to know him more deeply by seeing him in everyone that he came to redeem. To know Jesus and to know ourselves with freedom and the hope of everlasting happiness. That's already a taste of the joy of heaven. So a good and faithful servant of God can already taste the Master's joy in hope. And as his servants, we serve the Master faithfully and well, when we give of ourselves in and with him. That's what we do at every Mass. We place our lives, our sorrows, our loneliness, our boredom, our joys, and even our efforts in response to his grace. We place all of these things on the altar with the bread and wine, trusting that the giver of all that is good can transform our gift into something great. And he does. He transforms it into a taste of everlasting happiness in the body and blood of his Son. So what we offer back to God from what we've received is really his Son and ourselves in communion with him through his body and blood. And so today we pray that the Master, not a demanding taskmaster, but a loving Father, will continue to accept this sacrifice of his Son and of all his children with a beaming smile, saying, "Well done, my good and faithful servant. Come, share your Master's joy." Well, we serve God generously in this community of faith, seeking to be good stewards of what we've been given. So we'd like to thank everyone who's participated so far in our stewardship renewal. I want to share with you a few words from Father Jim about this. He says, our stewardship renewal is so important, not because we seek to have enough volunteers or enough financial resources for all of our ministries and the many good works that we do as a parish, but stewardship is important because it is about a transformation of heart. It's about a transformation of how we think and act. So as of today, we've reached about just over 60% of our stewardship goal. And to continue to support the growth of our parish ministries and the needs of our parish, we need to hit our participation goal of 1,000 households. So today we ask that those who have not yet participated take a couple minutes to fill out your pledge cards and to place them in the offertory basket, the preparation of the altar. So those pledge cards are on the end of the pew and along with some pens, if you'd be able to pass them down to those who might need them. If you've already participated, I invite you to pray for those who are filling theirs out. If you are still praying about your participation in the stewardship renewal, then we'd invite you to take this time to do that and to deepen that discernment.